The river doesn't forgive. That's the first thing people get wrong about the frontier. They think it's the land that's cruel, the desert, the mountain, the cold that comes in off the plains like something that means to stay. But it's the water that breaks you. It gives and it takes, and it never once explains itself, and the men who built their lives along the Powder River knew that better than anyone. They knew it the way you know a neighbor you've stopped trusting. Close enough to watch, far enough to run. Silas Merritt had been watching the Powder River for 22 years. He was 54 years old, lean in the way that comes not from health but from years of forgetting to eat. And he had a ranch 6 miles east of the town of Harwick, Wyoming, that was either a good piece of land in a bad season or a bad piece of land in a good one, depending on who you asked and when. He ran cattle, or had. He kept horses still, 4 of them, which was more than a man alone needed and less than he could explain to himself on most nights. He had a daughter of sorts, which was the kind of thing a man says when he doesn't quite have the words for what he means, and he had a silence in the east room of the house that he had stopped going into sometime around the winter of 1884 and had not entered since. Her name had been Corin, his wife. She had died in the river, not drowned, not in a flood or a crossing gone wrong. She had simply been there one April morning, walking the bank the way she did when she needed to think, and then she hadn't come back, and they found her 3 days later 2 miles downstream. The coroner said it was her heart. Silas had never believed that. He believed she had gone out to the river, and the river had taken her in the casual, indifferent way it took everything, sooner or later, and no one had asked its opinion, and no one ever would. That was 9 years ago. The ranch had grown quieter by degrees, the way a house does when the person who filled it is gone and no one can figure out how to take up that much space. His daughter Nell had married a man from Cheyenne and moved south. He had 2 letters from her a year, sometimes 3. He wrote back when he could find the words, which was less often than he would have liked. The hands who'd worked the place had drifted off one by one, finding better wages, easier ground, employers who remembered their names. Silas did not blame them. He had trouble remembering his own. He was patching the east fence on a Tuesday morning in October, the kind of cold that hasn't decided yet whether it means business, when he heard wheels on the road. He didn't look up. Wheels on the road usually meant the supply wagon from Harwick or one of the Dunmore brothers cutting through to their grazing land to the north. Neither one required his attention. But the wheels slowed, and then they stopped, and then he heard a voice he did not recognize say his name like a question. "Mr. Merritt?" He looked up slowly. She was young, 25, maybe 26. She sat on the bench of a hired wagon with a canvas bag beside her, and the particular posture of a woman who has been sitting in one place for a very long time and refuses to let it show. Her hair was dark and pulled back, and her coat was good quality but old, the kind of coat that comes from someone else's better years. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't place. Not quite afraid, not quite certain, but holding steady in a way that takes practice. "I'm looking for Silas Merritt," she said. "My name is Doris Aldren. My father was Nathaniel Aldren. He said you'd know him." Silas set down the wire. He did know Nathaniel Aldren. He had not thought of that name in years, but it came back to him now the way old names do, attached to something vivid and half-forgotten. Nate Aldren. Long drink of water, always cold, couldn't play cards worth a damn, and knew it, and played anyway. They had worked a cattle drive together through the summer of 1878, up through the basin and north toward the Montana line. 3 months of bad weather, and worse coffee, and the particular camaraderie that comes from surviving something together without either man making a scene of it. He had not seen Nate since the drive ended. Nate's girl, he said. It wasn't quite a question. He died in July. She said it plainly, the way you say a thing you've had months to practice saying. Pneumonia. He was in Laramie at the end. He left me something. She reached into the canvas bag and produced an envelope that had been opened and resealed with care. "He asked me to bring it to you personally. He said a letter alone wasn't enough. He said you needed to see the person asking." Silas looked at the envelope, then at her. "Asking for what?" he said. She met his eyes. "A winter." He didn't answer. He looked at the envelope in his hand and the river glinting in the low October light and the east fence that still needed patching, and he said, "There's coffee on the stove. Come inside." He didn't say it warmly. He said it the way you say something practical when you don't know yet what else to do. She came inside. He read the letter at the kitchen table while she sat in the chair closest to the door, not quite settling into it, the way someone sits when they're not sure they're meant to stay. Nate's handwriting was precise and small, the handwriting of a man who had been careful about things all his life. The letter was 2 pages. Silas read it twice. Silas. "If Doris found you, it means she's got more grit than I gave her credit for, which means I probably underestimated her the way I underestimated most things. I'm asking you to give her the winter. Not charity. She won't take charity. She can work. She can cook. She can keep accounts. She knows horses better than most men I've ridden with, and she'll tell you so herself if you ask her. What she doesn't have is ground under her feet. I made some poor choices in the last few years, and the truth is I'm leaving her very little besides this letter, and a name she's not sure is worth anything anymore. Your name." I told her you were the kind of man who pays his debts honestly and doesn't require a woman to be smaller than she is in order to feel useful. I told her one season. After that, it's her choice and yours. I know you're alone out there, Silas. I know what that ranch looked like the last time you wrote me, and I know what it means when a man stops writing. I'm not asking you to fix anything. I'm asking you to let her have a chance to find her own footing. You told me once on the drive that the worst thing you could imagine was a life where nothing new came through the door. I'm sending something through the door. I hope you'll let it in." Silas folded the letter. He sat with it for a moment, his hands flat on the table. "He wrote that I'd probably say no," he said. "He did," Doris said. "He wrote that you should tell me something if I did." She nodded once. "He said to tell you that a man who won't let anything change has already decided how the story ends, and that you deserve better than a story you've already finished." Silas was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind came off the river with that low, flat sound it makes when the temperature is dropping. "The spare room's at the end of the hall," he said finally. "Heat comes up slow in the morning. I'll put extra wood by the door." He stood and went to the stove to check the damper. He didn't look at her when he said, "I don't talk about Corinne. Not to anyone. I just need you to understand that." There was a pause. "All right," she said quietly. "Supper's at 6, he said. "I get up at 4:30, you don't have to." He heard her set her bag down on the floor. He heard her exhale, just once, like a breath she'd been holding for a long time. He went outside to finish the fence. "There is something I want you to notice right there in that moment." Nate Aldren could have written everything in that letter. He could have laid out every argument, every practical detail, made the case airtight. Instead, he wrote just enough to get her through the door. He trusted Silas to see the rest himself. That's either enormous faith or enormous presumption, and with men like Nate Aldren, it's always hard to tell which. The first 3 weeks were built out of routine and the kind of mutual restraint that takes real effort. Doris was up before dawn without being asked for it. She found the particular logic of the place on her own. The way the eastern pasture drained poorly and needed checking after rain, the way the bay mare kicked if you came at her from the left, the way the stove ran hot on the right side, and you had to account for that or everything burned. She didn't announce any of these discoveries. She simply incorporated them and moved on, and Silas noticed each one the way you notice something only after it's been fixed. She kept accounts. He had been doing it himself, badly, in a ledger that hadn't been properly reconciled since 2019. Within a week, she had found 3 billing errors with the supply merchant in Harwick, and a grazing fee he'd been overpaying by mistake for 2 years. She showed him the figures without comment. He looked at them for a while and then said, "I appreciate that." She said, "Of course." Neither of them made anything of it. She cooked in the evenings, mostly simple things, stew, cornbread, salt pork when the weather was bad. Once she made something with dried apples and a kind of spiced crust that he didn't recognize, and he ate 3 pieces of it without noticing he'd done so until he looked up and the plate was nearly empty. He didn't compliment it. She didn't seem to expect him to. They talked about the work. She asked practical questions, and he gave practical answers, and they built a functional understanding out of facts, the way 2 strangers sometimes build the earliest version of trust, not with declarations, but with information. Here is what I know. Here is what you need to know. See, we can be useful to one another. He watched her the way you watch weather when you're not sure of the season. Waiting for the storm, she never came. It was the middle of November, first real freeze, when his horse threw him. Not badly. He'd been pushing too fast over ground that had iced up overnight, and the gelding's back left went out from under him, and they both went down in a confusion of legs and cold, and Silas took the landing on his right shoulder, which had been through worse, and wasn't broken but wasn't happy about it either. He was on his back in the frozen grass, looking up at a white sky when Doris appeared above him. She crouched beside him and looked at him with the focused calm of a woman who has dealt with emergencies and found them manageable. "Can you sit up?" He could. "Dizzy?" "No, your shoulder is up. You'll want to ice it." She looked at the gelding, who had recovered himself and was standing a few feet away looking embarrassed. "Dobbs' front left looks like it might be a light sprain. I'll check his leg when you're upright." He got upright. She had already gone to the horse. He stood there in the cold for a moment, watching her run her hands down the gelding's leg with the kind of quiet competence that doesn't perform itself. He'd known maybe 3 people in his life who could read a horse's discomfort that well. Nate Aldren had been one of them. "He'll be all right," she said. 2 days easy." "Thank you," Silas said. The words came out slightly rougher than he intended, because he hadn't said them to anyone in a while and wasn't used to the weight of them anymore. She didn't answer, but for the rest of that day she was in whatever room he wasn't, and in the evening at supper the silence had a different shape. Less empty, more chosen. It started with the snow. 3 days into December, the first real snow of the season came down hard and steady, and by evening the world had gone white and still in the way it does out on the Wyoming plain, which is not romantic but is complete. Silas had been sitting by the front window watching it come when he heard the creak of the hall floorboard, and then Doris appeared with 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table beside him without asking and took the chair at the other end of the window. They watched the snow for a while. "He used to describe you," she said eventually. "Good things, I hope. Accurate things," she said. "He said you were the steadiest man he'd ever ridden with. Said you didn't panic and you didn't perform and you didn't need anyone to tell you you'd done something well. He was generous. He was specific," she said. He had a different word for generous. She turned her head slightly, looking at the snow, not at him. "He also said you'd built a good life and then let it get very small. He wasn't critical about it. He understood why. He just thought it was a shame." Silas looked at the white field beyond the glass. "He wasn't wrong," he said after a moment. She didn't push. That was the thing about her, the thing he hadn't expected. She had a way of saying something true and then leaving it completely alone, letting it sit wherever it landed without pressing for a response. It was an unusual skill. He had met very few people who had it. "What do you want?" he asked. "After the winter, where do you go?" She was quiet for a moment. "I used to know. Before my father got sick, I had an idea of it. A school in Denver had offered me a position. I'd been studying to teach." She paused. "When he got ill, I came back to Laramie to be with him. The position was filled by the time he died. I wasn't surprised. I was too tired to be surprised." She looked at her coffee cup. "I think now I'm looking for a place where something I'm capable of is actually needed. I don't think that's too much to ask." Silas looked at her. In the blue-white light from the snow, she looked older than her age and younger than her exhaustion, and he recognized something in that, the look of a person who has been carrying more than their share for long enough that they've stopped noticing the weight. "It isn't," he said. He didn't say anything else, but he stayed at the window longer than he usually did, and when he finally went to bed, he lay awake for a while, listening to the snow settle against the glass, thinking about the letter, thinking about Nate, thinking about the East Room and what it meant to leave a door closed long enough that you forget you ever chose to close it. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes after grief settles. Not the loud silence of fresh loss, but the smaller kind. The silence of a man who has made peace with being alone and isn't sure anymore if that peace was wisdom or surrender. I've thought about that distinction a long time. Silas Merritt had too, whether he'd admit it or not. In January, she organized the East Barn. He hadn't asked her to. He hadn't been in it properly in 2 years. It had become the kind of space that collects what you can't face dealing with. Old tack, broken tools, things Corrine had stored out there for reasons he no longer remembered. He came out one morning and found Doris inside, methodical and unhurried, sorting what was usable from what wasn't, hanging tack properly on the wall pegs, moving the broken things to a corner to be assessed. She looked up when he came in. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She said, "The rope hitch on the left wall was Corrine's, wasn't it? The one with the blue handle." He stopped. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I'll leave it where it is." She turned back to what she was doing. He stood there for a moment in the doorway of the barn, with the cold at his back and the careful, organized interior in front of him, and felt something he couldn't name, not grief exactly, not relief exactly, something more like recognition. The feeling of someone acknowledging a door without trying to open it. She liked things in their place, he said. He hadn't meant to say it. It came out anyway. "That shows," Doris said, without looking up. And she said it not like a consolation, not like a kindness offered across a distance, but like a simple fact about a person she had come to recognize through the shape of what they'd left behind. He was back at supper that night before he understood what had shifted. It was the first time in 9 years he had spoken her name to another person. The town of Harwick was not a warm town. Small towns on the Wyoming plain tended toward the practical. They would not go out of their way to be cruel, but they would watch, and they would measure, and they would make their assessments and file them away, and that filing took no account of grace or circumstance. Silas had lived alongside Harwick for 22 years and understood its mechanisms and had never particularly cared what it thought of him, which was the kind of freedom you could afford when you were a man with land and a long history in the county. The first time he brought Doris into town was the second week of January. He could feel the attention settle over them as they hitched the team outside the general store. Not hostile, but present, calculating. A woman named Mrs. Everett, who ran the dry goods with her husband and served as the town's unofficial record of everyone's business, came out to sweep the walk at the precise moment they arrived, which was not a coincidence. "Mr. Merritt," she said, and then to Doris, with the particular brightness of a woman waiting for information, "I don't believe we've met." "Doris Aldren," Doris said pleasantly. "I've been working at the Merritt Ranch since October, winter hire." Mrs. Everett's eyes moved to Silas and back. "Aldren, your people from Laramie?" "My father was. He passed in the summer. I'm sorry to hear it." She did not look particularly sorry. She looked engaged. "You'll stay through spring then?" "I expect so," Doris said without inflection. Inside, while they gathered the supply list, a man named Brackett Holloway, broad through the shoulders, the kind of confident that mistakes itself for authority, came up behind them in the narrow aisle. "Merritt," he said, not unpleasantly. Then his eyes moved to Doris with the considering look of a man who thinks the act of considering is itself a kind of ownership. Silas turned around. "Holloway," he said, "I didn't know you'd taken on a woman out there. Seemed like a solitary arrangement." He said it lightly, with the smile of someone who wants the credit for a joke without the accountability for what it implies. Silas looked at him with the flat steadiness of a man who has made decisions before, is making one now, and is very comfortable with how it will go. "Miss Aldren is the best ranch hand I've had in 10 years, he said. "She found 2 years of billing errors the first week, and she knows horses better than anyone in this county except myself. If you need a reason to speak to her, that's the one I'd use." He picked up the crate. "Excuse us." Holloway stepped aside. On the road back, with the wind coming off the plain and the horses finding their steady pace, the silence between them had a new quality, something slightly warmer and more complicated than the silences that had come before. "You didn't have to do that," Doris said. "I know," Silas said. She looked at him for a moment. "Why did you?" He watched the road ahead, the long, pale grass beaten flat by the January wind. "Because it was accurate," he said, "and because there are things that need to be said out loud even when nobody's making you say them." She turned back to the road. She didn't smile, exactly, but something settled in her face that had been less settled before. Brackett Holloway stood in the doorway of the general store and watched them go, and the thing he had been looking for, the thing he worked for on behalf of a man named Aldous Crane, who had a claim to some of the eastern grazing land adjacent to the Merritt Ranch and had been looking for a reason, had just become considerably more complicated. In February, he found her drawings. She had set up a kind of working space at the far end of the kitchen table. He had thought it was correspondence, accounts, and one morning when she had gone out early to check the horses, he passed the table and stopped. They were maps, not decorative ones, not the rough sketches a person makes to give directions. These were careful, detailed renderings of the land, the Merritt property, the eastern pasture, the river bend, the 3 sections of fence she'd repaired over the winter, done in pencil with a precision and a completeness that was more than technical. She had marked the places where the water ran wrong in spring. She had noted the slope grades and the sun angles and the points where the land was best for cattle and where it was best left alone. She had drawn the whole picture of a place she'd only known since October, and she had gotten it right. Not just right. True. He stood there looking at it for a long time. She had seen things he had stopped seeing. She had seen the whole shape of it, the way a person sees something they're actually looking at rather than something they've learned to look past. When she came back inside, he was still at the table. She stopped in the doorway. "I should have asked," she said. "No," he said. He picked up the map of the eastern pasture and looked at it. "Where did you learn to do this?" "My father." She came the rest of the way inside and hung up her coat. "He said that if you could map something, you understood it. He was a surveyor before he took to ranching." She paused. "He said most people look at land and see what they can take from it. He wanted me to learn to see what was actually there." "You've seen things I haven't seen in years," Silas said. She was quiet for a moment. "This land is worth looking at," she said simply. "Someone ought to." He set the map down with the particular care you give to something that has made you feel something unexpected. "Could you map the whole property, all of it?" She looked at him. "It would take until spring." "You'll be here until spring," he said. Something moved across her face, careful and brief, a kind of measuring. Then she went to the table and picked up her pencil. "I'll start with the north section," she said. "It's the one you're losing most to poor drainage. You should see it properly before the thaw." He sat down across the table and watched her work, and for the first time in a long time, a room in the Merritt house felt occupied in the right way. "What gets me about that scene is this." She wasn't trying to show him anything. She had mapped the land because she thought it was worth mapping. She had been paying attention, not to impress him, but because that's what she did. That kind of attention is rare, and when you're around it long enough, it wakes something up in you that had gone to sleep. In March, she told him about Crane. She had been sitting in the kitchen with the maps spread out when he came in from the east barn, and she had that particular stillness of someone who has made a decision about something difficult and is waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. "There's something you should know," she said. "Something my father didn't put in the letter because he was afraid it would change your answer." He sat down across from her. "Aldous Crane came to see me in Laramie 2 months before my father died." She kept her voice level. "He said that the Merritt Eastern grazing land had been inadequately filed in 1881 and that he had grounds for a counterclaim. He said the only way a woman without property could establish residence as a legal challenge to that kind of claim was as a documented employee of an established ranch with a current operating deed. She paused. He gave me until the end of winter to find a situation. He said if I couldn't, he'd move on the filing. Silas was quiet. That's why my father sent me to you, she said. Not only, he would have sent me to you regardless, I believe. But he knew about the claim, and he knew you had a good deed, and she stopped. He didn't tell you in the letter because he wanted you to keep me here because you wanted to, not because the situation required it. Silas looked at the map of the eastern pasture between them on the table. Crane, he said. He's been looking for a way to challenge the eastern boundary for years. Your deed is good, but it's old, and in this county old deeds get challenged by men with lawyers and patience. She met his eyes. You should know that I didn't come here dishonestly. I came because my father asked me to, and because I had no other option. But I came knowing more than the letter said, and you deserve to know that. Silas sat with it. Outside, the March wind had that particular restlessness of a season that hasn't decided what it wants to be, and the river, still running cold and high from the snowmelt, made its low, indifferent sound at the edge of the property. "Why are you telling me now?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "Because I don't want to stay somewhere I was kept under false pretenses," she said. "Whatever happens with Crane, whatever you decide about the winter being over, you should have known." He picked up the map. He set it down again. He stood up and went to the window and looked out at the river for a long time without speaking, and what moved through him was complicated enough that he couldn't put a single name to it. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in the dark and thought about Corrine, which he did less often now, and in a different way than he used to. Not with the raw incapacity of the first years, but with the older and quieter kind of grief that has learned to exist alongside ordinary life rather than swallow it. He thought about the East Room, still closed, still carrying what it carried. He thought about Nate Aldren, who had died in Laramie in July, knowing what he was sending north and trusting Silas with it anyway. He thought about the maps on the kitchen table, about a woman who had spent a winter learning the shape of his land well enough to draw it true, and who had told him the hard thing when she could have let it go. He thought about what it meant that she had told him. He was up before 4. He saddled the bay and rode to Harwick in the early cold, and went to the county deed office when it opened and asked for the Merritt filing from 1881. The clerk was a small, careful man who knew his records and produced the deed in 12 minutes. Silas read it. Then he asked about Crane's counterclaim. The clerk folded his hands. "It's a question of the Eastern Survey Line," he said. "Crane's lawyer filed a challenge on the basis that the 1881 survey used a creek marker that's since moved. If the deed holder can establish continuous and documented occupation of the disputed section, the challenge fails. If not," he stopped. "The other path is a family exemption. Married couple, on an operating ranch, the deed reverts to the longer-standing holder by default, but that requires documentation filed by—" He checked his papers. "End of this month." Silas said nothing for a moment. "What kind of documentation?" he said. The clerk looked at him. "Marriage record," he said, "or a formal deed partnership, but that takes longer to process." Silas rode home slow. The ground was still hard from the last freeze, and the horses' hooves rang against it with that high, cold sound, and the river ran alongside him for 3 miles before it bent south, and he watched it the whole way. He had watched that river through 22 years of seasons, and he had stopped trusting it a long time ago. But right now it looked like what it was. Water moving in the direction it needed to go, without apology, without ceremony. By the time he reached the gate, he knew. He found her in the east barn measuring the new fence boards he'd ordered in from Harwick. "Doris," he said. She set the measuring stick down, turned. He stood in the light of the barn door, and for the first time in 9 years, Silas Merritt said something he hadn't composed in advance, hadn't tested for safety, hadn't protected himself against. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not because of Crane, not because of the deed, though the deed matters, because this winter has been the first one in 9 years where I came inside in the evening and there was a reason to sit down." He looked at his hands. "Because those maps on the kitchen table are the truest thing anyone has shown me about this land in years, and I'd like to see what you'd do with another season of it." He looked up at her. "I'm not an easy man to know. I've been alone long enough that I've gotten comfortable with it in ways that aren't all good. I can't promise you anything large, but I can promise you I'll see you clearly every day. Not past you, not through you, I'll actually see you, and I think—" He stopped. "I think that's worth something." She looked at him for a long time. The bay mare shifted in her stall. Outside, the March wind moved through the eaves in its restless, changeable way. "My father knew this would happen," she said. "I think he planned for it." "I think he planned for the possibility," Silas said. "He was careful about the difference. Stubborn man. The best ones usually are." She looked at him. She didn't move. "There's the question of Crane," she said, "which has a practical answer. There is, and there's the other question," she said, "which doesn't." "There is," he said. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I told myself I came here for one winter. That's all it was supposed to be." "I know. I told myself I wouldn't." She stopped. Began again. "I didn't come here looking for this. Neither did I." She looked at the barn floor, then at him. "You should have asked me first," she said, "before telling the county office anything. You should have asked." "I know," he said. "I'm asking now." She took a breath, let it out. "The east pasture needs the full drainage map before April," she said. "If I don't finish it before the thaw, the measurements will be wrong. I know, and the north fence is going to need another week. Maybe 2. I know that, too." She looked at him for a long time, with the steady, clear look she had given the land when she was mapping it, looking for the true shape underneath the worn surface, finding it, holding it honestly. "Nate Aldren," she said quietly, "was the most irritating man I ever loved." "He was that," Silas agreed. The silence that followed was a different kind than any that had come before it. Not the silence of two strangers maintaining their distance, not the careful silence of mutual restraint, the silence of two people who have said enough of what needed saying and are now in the slower country that comes after. "Ask me," she said, he asked her, not formally, not with any ceremony he hadn't earned, standing in the cold of the east barn in March, with the sound of the river in the distance and the sound of the horses breathing close by, with all the plain, ordinary wreckage of his life visible around him, the old tack, the repaired fence boards, the measuring stick she'd set down, the blue-handled rope hitch on the left wall that had been Corrine's. He asked her, and she said yes. Aldous Crane came on a Friday in late March with a lawyer from Sheridan and a survey report and the air of a man who believed paperwork was the same as winning. He was wrong. The deed office had processed the documentation 4 days earlier. Mrs. Everett, who had been quietly watching the whole winter with more generosity than her manner suggested, had witnessed the marriage record herself. Small towns remember things, and they don't always remember them against you. Crane left without the ground he'd come for. The ranch changed in the months that followed. Slowly, the way real changes tend to happen, not dramatically, not all at once. The east pasture drainage improved with the remediation she'd mapped out before the thaw. The north fence held through the spring storms. A kitchen garden went in east of the house, laid out in careful sections according to light and water and what the soil would bear. The east room was still closed. That was all right. A closed door is not the same thing as a locked one, and Silas was beginning to understand the difference. In the summer, Doris finished the full property map. She gave it to him on an evening in July, rolled in a paper tube and tied with a piece of cord. He unrolled it at the kitchen table and sat with it for a long time, looking at the whole shape of the land laid out in her careful lines. Every section, every fence, every slope and water path and tree line, the Powder River along the western boundary, drawn the way she had learned to draw it, accurately, without romance, because honesty was more useful, and in the end more beautiful than flattery. In the bottom right corner, very small, she had drawn 2 figures standing at the east barn doorway, looking out at the land. He recognized the way they stood. He recognized that it was them. He looked up. She was watching him with the quiet look she had when she was measuring something. "You made it look like somewhere worth staying," he said. "It is somewhere worth staying," she said. And she said it not as a consolation, not as a comfort, but as the plain conclusion of a person who has looked at something carefully and arrived at an honest answer. He rolled the map back up. He held it like it mattered, because it did. That evening, for the first time in 9 years, he unlocked the east room. He didn't change anything inside it. He just left the door open. And somewhere in the long level distance, or perhaps only in the place where a man's love for his daughter outlasts his body and his poor choices and his uncertain hopes, Nathaniel Aldren, who had been a surveyor before he was a rancher and a father before he was either, rested easy. He had sent something through the door. It had been let in. Some things don't need an ending so much as they need an opening. Silas Merritt had been a man with the door shut for 9 years, and the hardest thing he ever did wasn't any of the things the frontier asked of him. It was deciding on a Tuesday in October to say come inside to someone he hadn't chosen about a life he wasn't sure he still wanted. The river doesn't forgive, but the land, if you learn to see it clearly, and if you're lucky enough to have someone help you see it, the land holds. That much is true.